The nor'easter had been coming off the water for 3 hours when the man in the ruined coat reached the front doors of Teresa House. Gray at his temples, a thin scar splitting his left eyebrow, mud past his knees from 2 miles of walking a flooded shore road. He asked for one phone call. The night supervisor stepped back like the mud might jump and told him this wasn't a shelter. The man held up both empty hands and said he was a decent man. The supervisor laughed and turned the lock. He got maybe 100 yards down that road before he saw the shape standing in the middle of it. An old man, barefoot in the rain, soaked through his pajamas, white hair plastered flat. The man in the ruined coat didn't ask a single question. He took off his coat, put it around the old man's shoulders, lifted him onto his back, and carried him through the storm to the same door that had just shut in his face. 10 minutes later, he was standing in a bright, warm lobby, with every head in the room turned toward him. Behind them, the old man was trying to speak, one hand raised, eyes locked on the man in the mud, fighting for the words harder than anyone in that room had ever seen a person fight for anything. He got out 3. They came out broken, and in the wrong order, and they didn't mean a thing to anybody who heard them. The woman coming down the stairs wouldn't let him finish. She put a hand on his shoulder, smiled the way people smile at children, and said he was confused and needed to go back to bed. Somebody guided him away down the hall, and he kept looking back the whole time. There was one person in that room who didn't look at the man in the mud the way the others did. A night nurse standing at the end of the hallway, still holding a medication tray, the only one who understood that a thief doesn't carry a man home on his back. She opened her mouth. Her boss looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, and she closed it again. Then the woman turned to face the man in the mud, and she didn't need 30 seconds to tell that room exactly what kind of man he was. He didn't argue. He didn't give his name. He looked up at the brass plaque above the reception desk, read the 2 words engraved on it, and held out his wrists. Not one person there had any idea what those 2 words meant to him, and nobody would find out for another 6 days, which was exactly how much time they had left. If stories like this one move you, hit that like button and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Subscribing helps more than you know. Now let's go back to that lobby, because what happened next changed everything. The police car door slammed shut with a hard, dry sound that echoed through the entire lobby, and then the red light on the roof swept once across the rain-streaked glass, before disappearing behind the row of pines beyond the gate. And in the silence left behind, Delia Mercer remained exactly where she was, holding the medication tray in both hands. The evening pills sat in their small plastic compartments, long overdue for distribution. She looked down at them and realized her hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Corinne Ashford turned her back on the door, smoothed the front of her jacket, and told the people still lingering in the lobby that it was over. Everyone should get back to work. There had been enough commotion for one night. Her voice had already returned to the one she always used when visitors came, sweet and rounded, as though the last 10 minutes had never happened. Wade Kessler stood beside the reception desk with one hand still tucked into the pocket of his uniform jacket, nodding along with every sentence she spoke. Delia walked back down the corridor toward the east wing, and she moved slowly, because she needed a stretch of hallway long enough to put everything that had happened over the past 3 hours back into the proper order. She had been the first person to realize the bed was empty. At 9 o'clock that evening, she had pushed the medication cart into Walter Pruitt's room just as she did every night, and the blanket had been folded neatly to one side, so neatly that for a moment she almost believed he had simply stepped into the bathroom. His slippers were still beneath the bed. She searched the bathroom, the common room, the laundry room, then the entire corridor connecting to the west wing. And when she returned to the nurse's station, she told Wade they needed to call the police right now, because an 84-year-old man was missing from the building while the wind was howling outside. Wade never looked away from the screen. He said Walter wandered around the building all the time, that he had done it the week before and the week before that, and every call to the police meant an incident report, and every incident report meant another line in the inspection file, and there was nothing in the world Mrs. Ashford hated more than inspection records. He told her to keep looking for another half-hour first. Delia said the rear side door had had a broken lock for months, and the alarm didn't sound. Wade said the side door was already on the repair list. She asked who that list had been submitted to, and when their turn was supposed to come, and he looked up at her exactly once, before asking whether she intended to finish her shift, or whether she wanted to go home early. So she kept searching alone, walking the back fence with a flashlight, calling Walter's name into the wind, one shoulder of her uniform soaked through. During that half hour, Walter had been outside in the rain, barefoot on a flooded road. Now, walking down the corridor, Delia thought about that and felt something terribly heavy pressing beneath her breastbone. She stopped outside his room. The light inside had been turned off. Through the narrow opening of the door, she could see him lying on his side with the blanket pulled to his chin, his eyes still open, staring into the darkness in front of him, awake. She stood there for a moment, then gently pushed the door open, set a glass of water on the bedside table, and he turned his head toward her. He looked at her, then lifted his right hand from beneath the edge of the blanket. His ring finger was bare, leaving behind a strip of skin paler than the rest, the mark of a ring that had rested there so long it had become part of the hand itself. His lips moved. 3 syllables came out, broken and uneven, and then he stopped, breathed, and tried again, and the second attempt was even worse than the first. Delia didn't understand. She sat down on the edge of the bed and told him not to rush, to take his time, that she had all night. Walter looked at her for a very long time, and in the dim light spilling in from the hallway, she could see that his eyes were completely clear, so clear and aware that she had to look away. He lowered his hand back onto the blanket and didn't try again. Delia sat with him a little longer, then stood and closed the door as gently as she could. Out in the corridor, the night shift schedule hung beside the linen room door. She glanced at it as she passed. For the entire floor that night, there was only one name listed: hers. 3 hours earlier, while Delia was still sweeping her flashlight along the back fence, everything in the lobby had happened so quickly that later she had to rebuild the sequence piece by piece before she could understand the order of it. The mud-covered man lowered Walter into the armchair beside the electric fireplace, and Wade Kessler was the first to rush over, pulling a blanket from the linen cabinet and wrapping it around the old man's shoulders, rubbing Walter's freezing hands between his own, asking whether he was all right, whether anything hurt. He did all of it in full view of 6 or 7 people, and everyone saw how attentive he was. Then he released Walter's hands, straightened up, and the entire lobby heard him ask where the old man's ring had gone. The question dropped into the middle of the room like a stone thrown onto still water. Someone stepped closer. Someone else bent down to look at Walter's hand. His ring finger was bare, with nothing left but that strip of skin paler than the rest. Wade said Walter had never taken it off, not once since Wade had started working there, not even when he bathed, not even when he went to medical appointments, and he said it with such genuine confusion that no one thought to question him. Then he stepped back, slipped his right hand into the pocket of his uniform jacket, and left it there. Corinne Ashford came down the stairs at that exact moment. She asked what had happened. Then, without waiting for anyone to answer, she swept her eyes across the room, taking in the old man soaked through beneath the blanket, the muddy water spreading across the tile floor, and the man standing in the center of the lobby, with mud smeared from the cuffs of his pants all the way up to his chest. Delia would remember later that Corinne took only that long to look, no more. Then she began to speak. She said that less than an hour earlier, this very man had stood outside that door asking to be let in, and that he had been turned away, and she asked the entire room whether anyone truly believed that a man who had just been thrown out would come back only to perform an act of kindness. She said everyone who lived nearby knew the rear side door had a broken lock, and that a man lurking out in the rain for an hour had more than enough time to circle around the building and discover it. She said Walter never got out of bed by himself at night, never had, and she asked how an 84-year-old man could possibly end up standing in the middle of a flooded road 200 yards away, unless someone had led him there. She said there was only one thing on Walter worth any money, and now that thing was no longer on his hand. Then she looked straight at the mud-covered man and said he hadn't carried Walter back because of his conscience. He had done it because he knew that an old man left lying in the road until morning would become a murder case, while an old man brought home would amount to nothing more than a missing ring. No one in the lobby said another word after that. In less time than it took for a song to play, she had built an entire man before their eyes, and everything she said fit perfectly with what they could see for themselves. The mud-covered man didn't answer her with a single word. He only looked at her, then at Walter sitting beneath the blanket, and there was no anger on his face, only something closer to exhaustion. Walter raised his hand. He tried. The whole lobby waited, and what came out of his mouth helped no one. Corinne placed a hand on his shoulder and said in her sweetest voice that he had been through too much tonight, that he was confused, that he needed to go back to bed and rest, and she motioned for an employee to help him away. It was at the very moment Walter was being guided across the threshold into the corridor that Delia pushed through the back door, her hair wet, one shoulder of her uniform darkened by rain, the flashlight still in her hand. She stood at the far end of the hallway and saw everything that remained of the scene. She saw Wade Kessler beside the reception desk, his eyes lowered to the tile floor, his right hand still motionless inside his pocket. And she saw Walter, as they led him past her, still turning his head to look back. And the mud-covered man lifted his eyes toward the brass sign above the reception desk and stared at it for a very long time, longer than any stranger would need to read the 2 words engraved there. The Warwick police station stood in a low building at the edge of town, and that night only 2 officers were still on duty. The younger officer led the mud-covered man into a room off to the side, pointed to the metal chair, then sat down at the computer and managed to type exactly 2 lines before the screen froze. He tried again. The connection had gone down when the wind knocked over a utility pole near the beginning of the coastal road, and with it went the entire report entry system, the fingerprint scanner, even the printer in the corner, which was blinking a useless red light. The officer radioed the central station and was told they would have to wait until morning at the earliest, possibly noon. He turned back toward the man sitting in the metal chair and said that meant no report could be filed yet, no charge could be entered, only that he would have to remain there until the system came back online. The man asked whether he was allowed to make a phone call. The officer said the station switchboard ran through the same line. The man asked about the cell phone in the officer's pocket. The officer replied that they didn't do things that way there, then stood and closed the door. The man didn't ask again. He sat with both hands resting on his thighs, his back straight, and for the rest of that night, he never changed his posture. Roughly 4 hours earlier, he had still been behind the wheel on the coastal road leading toward Warwick, driving alone, without telling anyone, because that was the only way to see a place as it truly was, rather than as people prepared it for him to see. Water had washed across the road at the curve, and he hadn't seen the drainage ditch beneath it. The right front wheel dropped in, the underside of the car struck the ground, and he knew immediately he wasn't getting out on his own. His phone had 1 bar of battery left before it died completely, too soon for him to make a call. He sat inside the car for more than half an hour, and not a single vehicle passed. So he opened the door, stepped out, and began walking toward the only light still burning at the far end of the road. In the holding room, he closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. He thought about the 2 words engraved on the brass sign, and he thought about how all he had to do was say one name, and within an hour someone would be here. This door would open, and everyone in the station would rise to their feet. But that name never traveled alone. It dragged files behind it, questions, cameras, and men in plain clothes who would ask why someone like him had been on that road at midnight, and the answer would lead straight to the gate with the brass sign. He had spent years making sure no one could connect those 2 things. He wasn't going to let one rainy night destroy that work. He opened his palm and looked at the mud that had dried into dark patches along the lines of his hand, then closed his fingers again. He thought about the old man being guided down the corridor, about the way he had turned his head to look back, and about the 3 syllables he had forced out with every bit of strength he had in the brightly lit lobby. He tried arranging them several different ways in his mind, and got nowhere. He tried to remember exactly how they had sounded, and realized he wasn't even sure he had heard them correctly. Near dawn, the officer opened the door, brought in a paper cup of coffee, and set it on the table. He said that if there was someone the man wanted to call, he could say so once the system came back. But if he had a name or any identification, it would still be better to give it now, because otherwise the report would list him as unidentified, and unidentified cases took a very long time. The man looked at the cup of coffee but didn't touch it. He said he would wait. The officer shrugged and closed the door again. The man sat motionless in that room until the first light of morning appeared through the small window high on the wall, and throughout all those hours, he didn't speak another word. The next morning, just after Delia finished handing over her shift and was changing in the staff room, Corinne called her up to the office on the 2nd floor. She didn't mention the night before. She invited Delia to sit down, poured her a glass of water, then turned the computer screen toward her and played a recording. Delia recognized the East Wing corridor immediately, and then recognized herself inside the frame, pushing the medication cart, stopping outside a door, stepping inside, and handing a medicine cup to an elderly woman lying in the bed beside the window. The image was perfectly clear. The date and time were displayed in the lower corner. Corinne let the footage run to the end, then rewound it to the exact moment Delia held out the medicine cup and paused it there. She asked whether Delia remembered that night. Delia said she did. Corinne asked whether she knew the name of the woman in that bed. Delia said the woman's name wasn't the one printed on the medication cup. However, that night the name card attached to the head of the bed had shown a different name, which she distinctly remembered checking before administering the medicine. When she returned the next morning, the card had been put back in its proper place. Corinne nodded slowly, then asked where Delia intended to explain that, who she expected to listen, and what proof she planned to use. She pointed at the screen and said the footage hadn't been staged, hadn't been cut, hadn't had a single second added to it. Everything in it was real, and any review board that watched it would see only one thing: a caregiver handing medication to the wrong bed. She said she had kept that recording since the previous winter, and had never submitted it anywhere, never filed a report, never allowed it to leave that computer. And then she asked whether Delia understood why. Delia didn't answer. Corinne closed the screen and said she was someone who knew how to keep her employees, and the employees she kept should also know how to keep what they happened to see. Then she wished Delia a pleasant day off. Delia took the first bus back to the city. The apartment she shared with Toby was directly above a laundromat in North Providence, and the smell of hot steam rising from downstairs had soaked into the walls year-round. Toby was sitting at the dining table with 2 books open and a highlighter in his hand. He looked up and asked how the night had gone, and she said it had been normal. He told her there was a study group at school that afternoon, told her some professor had said he could switch majors if he wanted, told her a handful of small things in the cheerful voice he always used to fill the silences in that room, and Delia stood leaning against the kitchen doorway, nodding along, hearing maybe half of it. When he turned back to his book, she opened the refrigerator. On the bottom shelf was a plastic container, and inside it were several vials of insulin lying side by side. She stared at them for a long time. She did the calculation she had already done hundreds of times in her head, the calculation between the number of days left in the month and the number of days that medication could still be stretched. Then she closed the refrigerator door very gently so Toby wouldn't hear it. She sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet door and both hands resting on her knees. From the other room came the sound of Toby's highlighter moving across paper. Delia closed her eyes and thought about Walter's hand rising in the darkness with that pale strip of skin around his ring finger. Thought about the 3 syllables he had struggled to force out. Thought about the mud-covered man who had stood in the middle of the lobby and hadn't said a single word in his own defense. Then she thought about her mother. She thought about the years when she had abandoned her studies to go to work. About the room at the end of the corridor in the facility across the river where her mother had spent her final months, and about the night Delia had arrived too late. She had carried that night with her everywhere for all these years, and she had learned how to live beside it by never allowing herself to think about it for too long. She opened her eyes, stood up, washed her face, and began making lunch for the 2 of them. The connection came back shortly before 9 o'clock that morning, and with it the desk phone at the duty station rang once and fell silent. The young officer opened the holding room door and said that if he wanted to make a call, he could do it now, but only one. The man stood, walked out to the desk, picked up the receiver, and dialed a number without needing to look at it. Someone answered on the other end before the first ring had fully finished. He said he was at the Warwick police station. He said, "Call Augie right now." He said, "No one is to come here except Augie." Then he set the receiver down, returned to the room, and sat back in the same metal chair. 40 minutes later, a dark-colored car pulled up in front of the station, and the man who stepped out was elderly, wearing a gray wool coat and carrying a leather briefcase worn at the corners. He didn't hurry. He pushed through the door, removed his hat, and asked who was in charge. The officer at the front desk, who had spent the entire morning barely bothering to look up when anyone entered, rose from his chair on his own. Inspector Frank Coyle came out from the back room with a cup of coffee still in his hand and asked what he needed. The lawyer said his name was August Rinaldi, then placed the briefcase on the desk, opened it, and began taking things out one by one, arranging them in a straight row in front of Coyle. He never raised his voice once. He said his client had been held there since the night before, and he asked where the detention report was. Coyle said the system had been down. Rinaldi asked where the handwritten report was, the kind state law allowed them to make on paper whether the machines were working or not. Coyle didn't answer. Rinaldi asked where the evidence was, and said that according to the facility's own statement, the missing item was a ring. So had that ring been found on his client? Had it been found anywhere at all? Had anyone seen it pass from one hand to another? Coyle set down his coffee. Rinaldi asked where the witnesses were, and said the only person who had been beside the victim throughout that entire period was his own client, while everyone else had merely seen a man carry an 84-year-old man home from the middle of a rain-flooded road. He went on to say that his client had asked to make a telephone call the night before and had been denied, that he had the name of the officer who had denied him, and that the length of the detention had exceeded what the law permitted when no charge of any kind had been filed. Then he tapped one finger lightly against the final sheet of paper and said that he hadn't submitted anything yet. He had only brought it for Coyle to see first, because he assumed a man with as many years on the job as Coyle would want to know exactly where he stood before anything received an official stamp. Coyle asked who his client was. August Rinaldi put his hat back on, adjusted it carefully, and said the name. The coffee on the desk remained untouched. Coyle shot up from his chair so quickly that his knee struck the edge of the desk, and for one moment no one in the room said anything. The young officer at the front counter turned his head and stared. Coyle asked again, more slowly this time, as though hoping he had heard wrong, and the old lawyer repeated the same name in the same voice, without adding a single word. Coyle said the man had no identification, hadn't given his name, and had been covered in mud from head to toe. August Rinaldi said mud could be washed away, but records stayed for a very long time. Then he asked, "Shall we open the door now?" Coyle went ahead of him, personally slid the key into the lock, and when the holding room door opened, the man was still sitting in the metal chair with both hands resting on his thighs, his back straight, in exactly the same posture he had maintained all night. He stood. Coyle began saying something about procedure, about a misunderstanding, about how the storm the night before had thrown everything into confusion, and the man walked past him toward the door without stopping. At the front steps, he turned his head and asked Coyle only one question, whether anyone had gone to check that morning if the old man was still alive or dead. Coyle couldn't answer. The man walked down the steps and got into the car. Across the street from the police station, 3 cars had somehow already been parked there by the time Enzo Marchetti stepped off the last stair, and as soon as he reached the sidewalk, the door of the first car opened. Nico Barsanti was waiting beside it, and behind him, several men stood spaced out along the curb, no one smoking, no one talking to anyone else. Nico looked at the mud that had dried hard along the legs of Enzo's trousers, looked at his wrists, then looked past him toward the police station door. He asked who. Enzo didn't answer. Nico asked again, more clearly this time, whether it was the night supervisor who had locked the door, the woman who had stood in the middle of the lobby saying those things, or this police station, and he said all Enzo had to do was say one word and by noon, everything would be put neatly in order. Enzo opened the car door, sat down in the back seat, and remained silent. Nico stayed outside for another beat, then closed the door and walked around to the other side. The car had gone some distance before Enzo finally spoke, and he said nothing about the night before. He told Nico to get him every medication purchase invoice from that facility, going back as far as possible, the daily medication administration logs, the night shift staffing schedules, the list of every payment families had transferred into the institution's accounts, and the maintenance contracts for the equipment. Nico asked how soon he needed it. Enzo said he needed it accurate, not fast. Then he added one more thing, that no one inside that building was to know someone was looking for those records. Augie Rinaldi, sitting in the front passenger seat, turned around. The old man said there was something Enzo needed to hear before he did anything else. He said that if Enzo walked through those gates, as the man who funded the place, even once, then within 48 hours, there wouldn't be a single document in that building left exactly where it had been. The books would be altered until they matched. Old invoices would disappear, and the people who were already afraid would have even more reason to remain silent. He said that woman wasn't ignorant. She was the kind of person who knew how to clean things up, and by the time she finished, all Enzo would have left were the stories of a few old people no one was willing to listen to. Augie said the only thing that carried real weight was paperwork, and paperwork stayed untouched only while the person keeping it didn't know anyone was watching. So Enzo had to remain outside. Enzo looked through the window. The car was traveling along the coastal road, and when they reached the curve, he told the driver to stop. His car was still tilted down in the ditch, the right front wheel buried deep in the mud, the water having receded enough to leave a line of washed-up debris stretched across the pavement. He got out, stood looking at the car for a while, then lifted his eyes toward the far end of the road, where the low roof of that building rose behind the pines. From there, the whole place looked peaceful. Nico stepped up beside him and asked whether Enzo was planning something he hadn't understood yet. Enzo said the brass sign above the reception desk inside that building bore his grandmother's name. Nico fell silent. Enzo went on to say that she had died in a nursing facility on the other side of the city, on a night when he had been far away and hadn't made it back in time, and that after all these years, he still hadn't forgotten that she had died without anyone sitting beside her. He said that place had been built so there would never be another night like that. Then he said nothing more about it. He turned back toward the car, and before getting in, he told Nico to put someone on the building, not to do anything, only to know who went in, who came out, what they carried, and what time they carried it. Nico asked how long. Enzo said until he told him to stop. Outside, the wind had died, and that morning the coastal road looked so clean it was as though nothing at all had happened there the night before. The following night, Delia arrived for work nearly an hour before the shift change. She told the afternoon attendant that she needed to check the medication storage because one of the residents had complained of dizziness the night before, and the other woman handed her the key without asking another question. The medication room was at the end of the east wing corridor, no larger than a closet, and the medication administration logs were arranged by month on a wooden shelf against the wall, their spines marked with month numbers in faded permanent marker. She took down the current volume first, opened directly to the page with Walter Pruitt's name, and read the line for his heart medication. Then she pulled down the previous month's book, then the month before that. She repeated the process with several more volumes, and the farther back she went, the slower her hands became. The medication code listed in the more recent books wasn't the same code she had been accustomed to reading for so long before. The active ingredient was still the same, but the number after it had changed, beginning with one of the spring volumes, changed in the middle of the record, with no note, no treating physician's signature in the margin as procedure required, whenever anything in a resident's prescription was altered. She stood there holding the open book in both hands, and thought about how, for all those months, she had personally placed those pills into Walter's hand, night after night, and not once had she looked closely at the number printed on the blister pack. She turned to the names of other residents. 3 more people had medication entries whose codes had been changed during the same period, and every one of them was someone who had no regular visitors. She set the book down, took out her phone, and began taking pictures. She photographed every page, photographed the spine so the month number could be seen, photographed the blank margins to show there were no signatures there, and she kept at it for more than an hour, one ear listening for footsteps in the hallway. When she was finished, she returned the books to exactly the same order, locked the door, and crossed to the records room at the opposite end of the building. There was a cabinet there containing copies of the quarterly fee notices sent to families. She pulled out the most recent file and found Pruitt's name. Walter had no one to send notices to, so that field was blank. But the other 3 names did, and on all 3 notices, under medication charges, the original specialized drug was still listed at the original price, every last dollar of it. Delia read them a second time to make sure she wasn't mistaken, then photographed those pages too. On her way back to the nurse's station, she passed the linen room and heard 2 people talking inside. One said strangers had been asking questions around the area for the past few days, asking at the grocery store, asking the shuttle driver, asking about things that didn't seem connected to one another. The other person asked who. The first hadn't had time to answer when both of them looked out and saw Delia standing beyond the doorway, and they fell silent. Delia nodded a greeting and continued walking. At midnight, when the entire floor had gone dark, she opened her private notebook and wrote down everything she had found in order, without adding a single comment. Then she thought of something else. Over the past 6 months, she remembered one elderly woman complaining that a pair of gold earrings had gone missing, another saying she had lost a bracelet, and both times the explanation had been that family members had taken the jewelry home for safekeeping. She remembered believing it. She added 2 more lines to the notebook. Then she made her usual round through the rooms, and when she reached Walter's door, she stopped. The light was off, but he was still lying on his side with his eyes open, just as he had been the night before. She stepped inside, pulled the blanket a little higher over him, and Walter reached out and closed his hand around her wrist. His hand was dry and cold, but his grip was very strong, far stronger than she would have expected from an 84-year-old man. He didn't say anything. He simply held her that way for a long time, then slowly let go. By morning, Delia didn't go home. She waited until Corinne reached her office, then knocked on the door. Corinne was opening her laptop when she looked up and invited Delia to sit in exactly the same voice she had used the day before. Delia didn't sit. She placed her phone on the desk opened the photographs one by one, and told her what she had found, speaking slowly, without raising her voice, without adding a single unnecessary word. Walter's heart medication code had been changed in the spring without the treating physician's signature. The same thing had happened to 3 other residents, and all 3 were people who had no regular visitors. Meanwhile, the fee notices sent to their families still listed the original medication and the original charge. When she finished, Delia stood there and waited. Corinne didn't pick up the phone. She didn't even look at the screen. She closed the laptop, leaned back in her chair, and asked a question that had nothing to do with anything Delia had just laid out in front of her. She asked who Delia thought was paying for that apartment above the laundromat. Delia didn't answer. Corinne went on, saying she knew where Delia lived, knew how much the rent was, knew which bus she took to work, and knew that a night caregiver's wages at a place like this were just enough for 2 people to survive as long as neither one of them got sick. Then she asked the second question. She asked who would pay for her brother's medication when Delia lost this job. She asked it in the voice of someone offering a reminder rather than making a threat. And that was exactly what made it feel heavier. Delia stood there and could clearly hear the air conditioner running in the room. Then she took the employee badge from around her neck, placed it on the desk beside the phone whose screen was still lit, and picked up the phone. Corinne looked at the badge, then at her, and said that in 3 days, Delia would come back asking for her job again. They all did. Delia walked out and closed the door behind her. That afternoon, she took a bus to a neighborhood of low houses on the edge of Warwick and knocked on the first door. The woman who answered was the daughter of an elderly resident in the last room of the West Wing, and she recognized Delia immediately, invited her inside, poured her some water, and asked whether her mother had slept well the night before. Delia told her. She told her about the medication codes, about the fee notices, about the missing signatures. The woman listened to everything without interrupting once, and when Delia stopped, she sat in silence for a long time, looking down at the glass of water on the table. Then she asked if she signed some kind of statement now, where her mother would be sleeping the following week. She said she had waited 2.5 years for a place to open there, that the waiting lists for decent facilities in the state were so long people put their names down and died before their turn came, and that she worked 6 days a week and couldn't care for her mother at home by herself. She said she believed every word Delia had just told her. Then she apologized. The second house was several blocks away. The man who answered was around 50, and he didn't invite her inside. He stood in the doorway, blocking it with his body, and halfway through her explanation he raised one hand to stop her. He asked whether she knew his mother had been moved through 4 different places in 3 years, whether she knew how long it took her each time to remember the way to the bathroom. Then he asked Delia directly whether she intended to have his mother thrown out onto the street. Delia said she only wanted someone willing to tell the truth. He said the truth didn't give his mother anywhere to sleep, then closed the door. Delia remained on the front step for a while longer, listening to the lock turn inside, then walked back to the sidewalk. Evening was beginning to settle in. She had gone only a few steps when she stopped. A few houses away, a black sport utility vehicle was parked tight against the curb, its windows completely dark, its engine off. No one got out, no one got in. Delia stood looking at it for a moment, then turned away. At the intersection, she looked back one more time. The vehicle was still exactly where it had been. 2 days later, Delia returned to Teresa House, but she didn't go in through the main gate. She circled around to the narrow path behind the building, where a chain-link fence separated the garden from the empty lot, because she knew they still brought the residents outside in the mornings to sit there for about half an hour. Walter was sitting alone on a wooden bench near the corner of the fence, a blanket spread across his lap. He saw her before she had a chance to call out. He glanced once toward the back door, then slipped a hand beneath the blanket and pulled out a thin notebook, the kind with a stiff paper cover people often use to write down their daily tasks, and pushed it through the opening in the fence. Delia took it and opened it. Inside was handwriting, shaky, with some strokes wandering completely outside the ruled lines, but everything had been arranged in careful order. 1 page for each day, the date written in the upper corner. Beneath it, short lines. Tonight there was only 1 person working the entire floor. The woman in the last room called from 10 o'clock until almost 11 before anyone came in. The back door still hasn't been fixed. The pill is a different color from yesterday's. Delia turned quickly through the pages and saw that the entries stretched across nearly 4 weeks without a single day missing. She looked up. Walter was watching her, and he pointed at the notebook, then at her, telling her without words to take it and go. She asked whether he was afraid. Walter held out his hand for the notebook, turned to the final blank page, pulled the pen clipped inside his shirt pocket, and began to write. He wrote slowly, one word at a time, having to stop halfway through to catch his breath. You can only frighten someone who still has something left to lose. I have nothing left. He turned the notebook around so she could read it. Delia read those 2 lines and had to look away for a moment. When she looked back, Walter had already turned to the next page and was lowering the pen again. He managed to write one word, only one, when someone called his name from the back door. A figure stepped out onto the porch. Walter snapped the notebook shut, shoved it through the fence to Delia, and pushed her hand away. He sat up straight, pulled the blanket fully over his lap, and by the time the staff member reached him, he was sitting perfectly still, staring out across the empty lot like an old man simply enjoying the morning sun. Delia backed into the pine trees and remained there until the wheelchair had been pushed back inside and disappeared from sight. Then she opened the final page again. There was only one unfinished word, its last stroke trailing downward. It meant nothing at all. That afternoon, she went to the address on the business card Nico had discreetly left for her, a small law office on the 2nd floor of an old building in Providence, where the elevator moved slowly and the wooden hallway creaked beneath her feet. She knocked. Nico Barsanti opened the door, and he recognized her immediately. He didn't ask who she was. He simply turned toward the room and told the man standing by the window that this was the woman who had walked out of that building twice during the week, the one the men sitting in the car had written down in their notes. The man turned around. Delia recognized him, not by his face, because that night his face had been covered in mud, but by the thin scar cutting across his left eyebrow, and by the way he stood, both arms hanging at his sides, completely still. He recognized her too. There were only 2 chairs in front of the desk, and Augie was sitting in one of them on the other side. Enzo Marchetti pulled the chair he had just been using away from the desk, pushed it toward her, then stepped back and leaned against the wall beside the window. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. She sat down and placed the notebook on the desk. Augie turned through the pages one by one, reading very carefully, sometimes stopping for a long time over a single line, and when he reached the end, he closed the notebook, removed his glasses, and wiped the lenses with the edge of his handkerchief. Then he said he wasn't going to lie to her. He said what was written in that notebook was true. He believed that. But before any review board, it would still be nothing more than the word of a man whom everyone in that building had already documented as confused. He said they would ask who had witnessed any of it, and there would be no one. He said they needed something else, something that could be checked against the other side's records. One number set against another number. Without that, the notebook was only a notebook. The point of comparison Augie had spoken about was something Enzo began searching for from the other end. It took Nico less than 2 days to trace where the small valuables from that facility had been going. A pawn shop wedged between a laundromat and an auto parts store on the edge of Pawtucket, its front window covered with old advertisements. A little bell above the door giving a dry chime whenever someone walked in. That afternoon, Enzo went inside alone. Nico stayed outside, leaning against a lamppost, without looking through the window. The man behind the counter was polishing a watch with a paper towel. He looked up and asked what Enzo needed. Enzo didn't answer. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, opened it, smoothed it flat with the back of his hand, and slid it across the glass counter. The other man glanced down, and the paper towel in his hand stopped moving. The sheet contained a list. The house on the next street, and the amount still owed on it, along with the name of the bank, the car parked outside, and the finance company holding its title. The short-term loan he had taken out in the spring from a place that wasn't a bank. 3 overdue rent payments on the shop. The names of the 2 people who had guaranteed his debt. There wasn't a word above or below any of it. Only those lines, typed neatly and cleanly. The man behind the counter read the entire page, then looked up. He asked who Enzo was. Enzo said he hadn't come to get the items back. He said those things had left this place a long time ago, and he already knew that. He said he had come for one reason only, so the other man would understand something. He knew how to count. Enzo placed one finger on the sheet and pushed it a little closer. Then he said he needed the recordings. He said he wanted everything the cameras in this shop had stored from the past 6 months. Nothing selected, nothing cut, and he wanted the intake ledger as well, with the names and signatures of the people who had brought the items in. The man behind the counter said his cameras only kept footage for 30 days. Enzo noted that the owner had an external hard drive in the back room, the one the man used to make a backup at the end of every month, and then he recited the number printed on the label attached to the back of the drive. The shop became so quiet that the washing machines next door could be heard through the wall. The man behind the counter stood still for the length of a breath, then set down the watch and the paper towel, walked into the back room, and Enzo heard a metal drawer slide open. The man returned carrying a black hard drive inside a cloth pouch and a thick-bound ledger. He placed both on the counter, pushed them toward Enzo, then pulled his hand back very quickly, as though the glass were hot. Enzo opened the ledger, turned through several pages, stopped at one, and looked at the signature column. The same handwriting appeared again and again, separated by several weeks, continuing across many months. He didn't ask for the name of the person who had signed. He closed the ledger, picked up both items, and straightened. The man behind the counter asked what happened now, his voice suddenly hoarse. He asked whether Enzo intended to give those things to the police, and if he did, where his own name would appear in all of it. Enzo said that didn't depend on him. It depended on whether the man called anyone between now and then. The other man said he wouldn't call anyone. Enzo gave a single nod. He picked up the sheet of paper from the counter, folded it back into quarters exactly as it had been before, and slipped it into his inside pocket. Then he walked out. The bell above the door gave another dry chime behind him. Out on the sidewalk, Nico pushed away from the lamppost and followed him toward the car, his eyes flicking toward the cloth pouch in Enzo's hand. He asked whether it had gone well. Enzo said they now had one end of the thread. He said the other end was still inside that building, and they still hadn't been able to reach it. The other end of the thread reached Enzo the following evening, and it didn't come from that building at all, but from a place no one had expected. Nico brought up a cardboard box filled with copies of the facility's medication purchase invoices, obtained from the supplier rather than from the institution itself, and set it down on the table in the small room behind Augie's office, before beginning to sort the papers into stacks by month. Enzo sat down and started with the oldest stack. He read slowly, turning one sheet at a time, tracing the product code column with the tip of his finger. Everything remained steady for a long stretch, the same medication, the same price, the same approval signature. Then he reached an invoice from the spring of the previous year. The product code changed. The unit price dropped to less than half of what it had been, and in the lower right corner, in the space reserved for the seller, there was a stamp bearing the name of a pharmaceutical distribution company Enzo had never heard of. He read the name a second time. Then he told Nico to find out who was behind it. Nico took his phone into the hallway. He came back about 15 minutes later, and before he spoke, he closed the door. He said the company was registered in a nephew's name, but the person providing the money and signing the papers wasn't the nephew. He said the name was Sal Fiore. Enzo didn't look up immediately. He set the invoice down, smoothed the curled edge of the paper flat, and only then raised his eyes to Nico. He asked whether he was certain. Nico said he was, and added that the signature on every order that followed was the same handwriting, continuing from the spring of the previous year all the way through the month before, appearing every single month. Enzo sat in silence. He remained that way for a very long time. Sal Fiore was the man who had stood beside his father since the days when the entire family still lived in a third-floor apartment in Federal Hill. The man who had carried Enzo in his arms before Enzo could walk. The only person in the organization who had been allowed to call Enzo's father by his familiar name in front of other people. At his father's funeral a few months earlier, Sal Fiore had stood to the right of the coffin. Enzo remembered the man placing a hand on his shoulder as the casket was lowered, and telling him that from then on, if he needed anything, he should call his uncle. Nico stood on the other side of the table and said nothing more. He had worked with this man long enough to know that this kind of silence wasn't a moment to wait for orders. He simply stood there with his arms at his sides, looking down at the stacks of paper, and didn't dare ask a single question. The desk lamp cast a pool of yellow light across Enzo's face, and outside, the sound of a passing car rose and slowly faded away. Enzo kept turning pages. He went through the rest of the stack from the previous spring, then the summer, then the fall, and every stack contained those invoices, regular and unbroken, not a single month missing, each one showing a small difference in price that, added together, became a figure that wasn't small at all. He separated every invoice bearing that company's name and placed them in their own stack, and when he finished, the stack was nearly as tall as his hand standing upright. He looked at it, Then he asked Nico only one question, whether anyone else in the family knew about this. Nico said he hadn't told anyone. Enzo told him to keep it that way. He stood, walked to the window, and remained there with his back turned. Nico waited. He waited a very long time, long enough to start opening his mouth twice and stop himself both times. Finally, Enzo spoke, and his voice was as even as it always was, not raised in the slightest. He told Nico to find out exactly how the company's people had delivered the medication into that building, who had signed for it on the facility's end, and on what days of each month the deliveries had been made. He told him to leave the stack of invoices exactly where it was, not to take it anywhere, not to make copies, and not to tell Augie until Enzo said so. Nico nodded and walked out. At the door, he stopped, turned back, and asked what would happen if it really was Sal. Enzo didn't turn around. He said they would deal with that later. The door closed, leaving him alone in the room with the separate stack of invoices on the table. And Enzo remained by the window that way for a very long time afterward. What Augie needed was one number set against another, and Delia knew where those numbers were. She had photographed the recent ledgers, but the ones from the spring of the previous year, the ones covering the exact week when the medication code had first been changed, were volumes she had never opened. They were on the lowest shelf in the medication room, and the medication room was locked. She called Wade Kessler late that afternoon. She didn't plead with him. She simply said she needed to get inside once, only once, and told him she knew he was working the night shift that evening. The other end remained silent so long that she thought he had hung up. Then he said, "Side door near the laundry room, 2:00 in the morning, and don't turn on the lights." She arrived exactly on time. The door had already been left slightly open. Wade stood hidden behind it, wouldn't look her in the face, and simply handed her the key and said, 15 minutes, no more, before walking back toward the nurse's station. Delia moved down the dark corridor, using only the glow from her phone screen held low near the floor. The medication room opened onto the familiar smell of old paper. She sat down on the floor, pulled out the ledgers from the lowest shelf, found the correct month, and began taking pictures. One page at a time. The spine of the book, the blank margins. Her hands moved very quickly and very quietly. In the upper corner of the screen, the battery percentage had already dropped into the single digits, and every time the flash fired, it fell a little farther. She turned off the flash, opened the medication room door a little wider so the emergency light from the corridor could spill inside, and kept taking photographs in that pale blue glow. She finished the entire first ledger, moved on to the second, and was turning to the final week when the hallway lights came on. Every light in the corridor, all at once, from one end to the other. Delia froze. Then she heard the sound of heels. They weren't Wade's shoes. She gathered the ledgers against her chest, stepped out of the medication room, locked the door with 2 trembling fingers, and slipped into the linen room beside it, pulling the thin door shut behind her. Inside, it was pitch dark and cramped, filled with the smell of clean fabric and laundry softener. She pressed herself between 2 shelves of towels, holding the stack of ledgers against her body, and stopped breathing. The heels stopped directly outside. Only a thin wooden door separated them. Corinne Ashford was speaking on the phone. She said she had told them this week, not next week, and she didn't want to hear another word about the delivery schedule. She listened to the person on the other end for a moment, then gave a soft laugh, that short little laugh Delia had heard too many times during the 2 years she had worked there. Corinne said no one in that place ever read those numbers. No one ever had, and the people who knew how to read them were all gone now. Then she said one more thing, lowering her voice, that the inspectors only looked at paperwork, and paperwork was something she could take care of. The heels sounded again, moving 3 steps toward the linen room door, then stopped. Delia could hear her own breathing and tried to hold it back. In her hand, the phone screen suddenly lit up with a low battery warning, casting a small glow through the crack beneath the door. She pressed it against her chest. Outside, there was silence for about 3 breaths. Then the heels turned away and slowly faded toward the staircase. Delia remained inside for a long time after the footsteps had disappeared completely. When she finally stepped out, the corridor lights were still blazing, and the entire hallway was empty. She returned the ledgers to exactly where they had been, locked the medication room, and went to the side door. Wade was waiting there. She handed him back the key. He took it, and in that moment she saw his face beneath the emergency light. He was deathly pale. His forehead was wet with sweat, even though the night was cold. He asked whether she had gotten what she needed, and she said she had, then thanked him. He didn't answer. He opened the door and let her out, and after she had walked some distance along the path behind the building, she looked back. Wade was still standing in the doorway, one hand gripping the edge of the door, watching her leave, and he didn't look anything like a man relieved after doing a good deed. 6 days remained. The next morning, before the office had even opened, Wade Kessler was already waiting in the second-floor hallway. He had stayed awake through the rest of the night, calculating the same thing over and over. If everything came apart and he stayed silent, he would be the man who had opened the door. If he spoke first, he would only be the man who had discovered what happened. So when Corinne Ashford slipped her key into the lock, he stepped toward her and told her everything. Told her that the former caregiver had called him, that he had pretended to agree because he wanted to see what she was planning to do, that she had entered the medication room at 2 o'clock in the morning and stayed inside for a very long time with her phone in her hand. His voice trembled, and the words came quickly. Corinne listened to all of it without interrupting once, then opened the office door, invited him inside, and thanked him. She said she had always known who the loyal people in that building were. Wade walked out with his legs feeling almost weightless and with the sense that he had just escaped something, and he had no idea that he had just pressed the button that would set everything else in motion. Corinne closed the door, sat down, and did 3 things that morning. The first was to send the recording from the previous winter to the state licensing board, along with a short letter written in the voice of a manager burdened by conscience, saying that she had struggled with the decision for a long time, that she had tried to keep the matter private out of compassion for a young employee, but that the woman no longer worked there, and Corinne now felt it was her responsibility to report what had happened. The board responded within 48 hours with a temporary suspension, effective immediately, pending investigation. Delia read the letter on Thursday afternoon, while standing at the bottom of the laundromat stairs, and she had to read it 3 times before she fully understood what it meant. Without a license, no caregiver would hire her. Without a job, there would be no group insurance. Without group insurance, everything in the bottom shelf of her refrigerator would have to be bought with cash, at full retail price. She sat down on the lowest step and stayed there until darkness fell, then went upstairs, made dinner, and said nothing to Toby. The second thing Corinne did was issue a series of notices for additional care charges to every family with a relative living at the facility, each one listing an amount large enough to keep someone awake at night, and beneath it, a small line stating that the charges might be reviewed for reduction or waiver for families who continued to support the facility. The woman who had once poured Delia a glass of water called her 2 days later. She was crying on the phone. She said she was sorry, said she couldn't bear it, and said that if Delia submitted anything anywhere, please don't mention her name. The man who had shut the door in Delia's face didn't call. He sent only 1 line, telling her not to contact him again. The third thing was the quietest and also the cruelest. Corinne began the process of transferring Walter Pruitt to a facility in Fall River, nearly an hour's drive away across the state line. The paperwork listed the reason as the need for specialized care for someone suffering from language impairment after a stroke, complete with a medical evaluation, signatures, and even a report documenting the storm night incident as evidence that the resident had left the facility on his own and could no longer safely remain there. Not a single line of it violated the law. The transfer was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Delia learned about it from a former coworker who messaged her close to midnight, and she lay awake staring at the ceiling until morning, counting down each day that remained, understanding that once that vehicle pulled away, everything Walter had written during those 4 weeks would become nothing more than paper. And upstairs at Teresa House that evening, Corinne Ashford turned off the light in her office and remained standing beside the window. Her phone had rung 3 times that day from 3 numbers she didn't recognize, and all 3 times there had been silence on the other end, and she couldn't understand why something so small had sent a chill down her spine. 5 days remained. Delia no longer had a license, no longer had a job, and no longer had anything left to lose in the way she had once feared, so that morning she did what she should have done long ago. She went to the public library in downtown Providence, sat down at one of the public computers, and searched Corinne Ashford's professional record in the state's public database. Corinne held a valid long-term care facility administrator's license, still active, with no disciplinary actions on record. Beneath that was her employment history. Delia skimmed the names of the places where Corinne had worked, and she had nearly reached the bottom of the page when her eyes stopped. Near the end was the name of a chain of nursing facilities across the river, and beside it was the period during which Corinne had served as deputy executive director. Delia knew that name. She had taken the bus to that name 3 times a week for months. She had sat in the hallway of that name and memorized every crack in the tile floor. Her mother had died inside that name. Delia sat perfectly still in front of the screen for a very long time. Then she opened another window and kept searching, this time looking up that chain in the State Archive of Inspection Reports and filtering by that exact year. There was one file. It ran for more than 10 pages and was written in administrative language as dry as timber. Delia read from the beginning. The inspection team had found that the facility had reduced night shift staffing below the level recommended by the state, had found that on certain floors, only one caregiver had been assigned to all residents between 10 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning, had found that the average response time to resident call bells had increased significantly compared with the previous inspection, and had noted that the facility had explained the changes as an effort to optimize operating costs. On the final page was an appendix listing the related internal decisions. There was one line showing the decision number, the date it had been issued, the adjustment to night staffing levels, and the name of the person who had signed it, Corinne Ashford. The date was nearly half a year before Delia's night. Delia read that line. Then she read it again. Then she sat up straight and looked out the library window, where several people were walking past on the sidewalk carrying paper bags, and for a stretch of time she couldn't measure. She couldn't think at all. That night, she had taken an extra shift because they paid time and a half for weekend work, and that month the cost of medication had already exceeded what she had set aside. She had changed buses twice to get across the river. The second bus had been late. When she walked into the third-floor hallway, someone was already standing outside her mother's room, and that person spoke in the kind of voice people use only once in a lifetime with each person. 40 minutes. She had lived with that number for all those years. She had placed it beneath everything else and built the rest of her life on top of it. She had believed that if she hadn't taken that shift, if she had caught an earlier bus, if she had run faster from the bus stop to the entrance, then her mother wouldn't have had to die in a room with no one beside her. She had believed it for so long that it had become part of her, like a broken bone that had healed crooked but still allowed a person to walk. And now she was sitting in front of a screen in a public library and seeing that on that night there had been no one on the entire third floor to answer a call bell. Not because they were busy, because they weren't there. Because nearly half a year earlier, a woman had sat in some office and signed a piece of paper to save operating costs, and that piece of paper had decided that no one would walk past her mother's door that night. Her 40 minutes had never been the thing that decided anything. Delia raised both hands and covered her face. She sat that way in the library, surrounded by the sound of pages turning and the printer running at the counter across the room, her shoulders trembling without making a sound, and no one sitting nearby looked up. A long time passed before she lowered her hands, wiped her face with a tissue, and clicked print. The printer at the counter produced more than 10 pages, still warm. She picked them up, folded them in half, and walked out of the library. 3 days remained. The refrigerator in the apartment above the laundromat had been making a rough, choking sound for an entire week before it finally stopped. And it stopped during the day, while both of them were out. When Delia came home, the refrigerator door was still closed. The light inside still didn't come on, and at first, she thought there had been a localized power outage. Toby had gotten home 2 hours before she did. He had opened the refrigerator, picked up the plastic container from the bottom shelf, touched the side of one of the vials, and known immediately what had happened, because he had lived with those vials long enough to understand that the medication only remained effective within a narrow temperature range, and once it stayed outside that range too long, it wasn't medicine anymore. He had stood there holding the container and thought about the suspension letter his sister had read 3 times at the bottom of the stairs, thought about how much replacing the medication with cash would cost, thought about the look on her face if he told her. Then he put the container back where it had been, closed the refrigerator, and said nothing. He intended to tell her at the end of the week, after he had found some kind of solution. That night, close to 2 o'clock in the morning, Delia heard a noise in the other room and jolted awake. Toby was lying on the floor beside his desk, books scattered around him, his body cold and drenched in sweat, his breathing fast and shallow, unresponsive when she called his name. She called an ambulance, and while she waited, she opened the refrigerator, picked up the plastic container, and understood everything in a single second. At the hospital emergency room, They took him inside very quickly, and the woman at the admissions desk asked Delia about insurance. Delia said the card had stopped being valid the week before. The woman typed a few things, then began talking about a deposit, a payment agreement, and the need for someone to put their name on the paperwork. Delia stood there in a coat she had thrown over her pajamas, and she took out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and realized she had no one left to call. She no longer had coworkers. She had no relatives in the state. Finally, she found the number for the law office, the only number she had saved from the business card, and she pressed call without believing anyone would answer at that hour. The phone rang twice, then someone picked up. It wasn't the old lawyer's voice. She hadn't even finished her second sentence before the person on the other end asked which hospital she was at. 40 minutes later, Enzo Marchetti walked into the emergency room. He didn't ask what had happened. He went straight to the desk, listened while the woman there explained everything, took the pen, and signed where she pointed. He handed the papers back, then went and sat in the row of plastic chairs in the hallway, 2 seats away from Delia. He didn't say a single word through any of it. Near dawn, the doctor came out and said Toby had stabilized, that the danger had passed, and that he would remain there for another day of observation. Delia nodded, thanked him, then sat back down. And when she did, the thing she had been holding inside for the past several days finally broke loose. She spoke without looking at Enzo, speaking to the wall in front of her. She told him about that night across the river, about the bus arriving late, about the person waiting outside her mother's room. She said that for all those years, she had believed her mother had died alone because Delia had arrived too late. Then she said that 3 days earlier, she had been sitting in the library when she learned that on that night there hadn't been a single person on the entire floor to answer a call bell, and she had learned the name of the person who had signed the paper that made it happen. She said she didn't know what to do with that knowledge. She said she had spent all those years hating herself for something that had never been her fault, and now that she knew the truth, she didn't feel any lighter at all. Enzo sat quietly and listened to every word. He didn't tell her she wasn't to blame. He didn't tell her everything would be all right. He sat looking at the line of ceiling lights stretching down the hallway. Then he told her that his grandmother's name had been Teresa, that she had raised him from the time he was small, that when she became weak, he had been in another city, and that they had placed her in a facility he had chosen over the phone because he had believed one place was much like another. He told her that on her final night, he hadn't been there. He told her that even after all those years, he still couldn't picture whether she had been lying there with someone beside her or with no one at all, and that it was the only question in his life whose answer he couldn't buy. 2 days remained. On Monday evening, a seasonal windstorm swept across the coastal region and brought down the power line near the edge of Warwick for the second time that month, and the entire area fell into darkness in a single instant. At Teresa House, a few battery-powered emergency lights came on, but everywhere else remained dark. Wade Kessler ran down to the storage room, unlocked it, and found the backup generator sitting exactly where it had always been, covered with a tarp, clean, just as the inventory record said. He pulled the starter cord. The engine came to life. The hallway lights flickered on. The machines in the residence rooms started humming again, and before anyone could make it down the full length of a corridor, the engine began to weaken and then died completely. The fuel tank was empty. The maintenance contract with the service provider had been terminated more than a year earlier, and since then no order had ever been placed for reserve fuel. On paper, the equipment still existed, still appeared on the inventory list, still carried the mark that said ready for use. In reality, it was nothing more than a block of metal sitting in a storage room. Word got out of the building within half an hour, and the person who told Delia was the same former coworker who had messaged her about Fall River. Delia was sitting beside Toby's hospital bed. He told her to go, said he was fine now, said he had nurses there. Delia caught the last bus, got off at the beginning of the coastal road, and walked the rest of the way. The main gate was locked. She went around to the path behind the building, reached the section of chain-link fence that sagged low in one place, something she had known about for a long time, and climbed over it. She no longer had a license, no longer had an employee badge, and if anyone wanted to make trouble for her, simply being inside that building that night would give them more than enough reason to do it. She went in anyway. Inside, 3 employees were running back and forth with flashlights, trying to calm 40 people in the dark, while calls came from several rooms at once. Delia took off her coat, dropped it onto a chair, and started working. About 20 minutes later, light flooded in. It wasn't electricity. Outside, a line of vehicles arrived and parked in a wide arc around the front and both sides of the building, their headlights aimed inward, and every one of them turned on at once. White light poured through the windows, washed across the walls, stretched down the corridors, and in every room the darkness retreated. An elderly woman in the corner room began to cry because she thought morning had come. The front doors opened, and Enzo's men began carrying supplies inside: oxygen tanks, gas-powered heaters, blankets still sealed in plastic, flashlights, water. They were broad-shouldered men in dark clothing whom no one in that building had ever seen before. But they went from room to room, and before entering each one, they stopped to read aloud the name written on the card at the head of the bed. Only then did they step inside. Nico Barsanti stood in the lobby assigning people to different corridors. Wade Kessler leaned against the reception desk, watching all of it unfold, unable to say a single word. Delia was kneeling beside the bed of an elderly woman at the far end of the east wing, pulling the blanket up to the woman's shoulders and tucking the edge beneath her back to keep out the cold. When the woman closed her hand around Delia's finger, Delia looked up. At the far end of the corridor, Enzo stood with a flashlight in his hand, the beam angled down toward the floor, and he was watching her. How long he had been standing there, she didn't know. They looked at each other across the full length of the hallway, between the voices calling out from the other wing and the sound of footsteps moving over the tile. Neither of them said anything. Then he walked toward her, held out the flashlight, waited until she had it securely in her hand, and turned away. He walked back toward the lobby through the darkness without a light, one hand following the edge of the wall. Near dawn, when everyone had settled and the heaters were running steadily, Delia passed through the common room to get more blankets. It was dark inside, lit only by the headlights shining through the windows from outside, and Walter was sitting in the chair beside the old piano against the wall. He wasn't asleep. He sat upright with one hand resting on the piano lid, softly humming some melody under his breath. No words, only air. One day remained. The following afternoon, in the room behind the old restaurant in Federal Hill, where the family had been meeting since the days when his father was still alive, more than a dozen men were already there before the appointed time. They were all standing. No one pulled out a chair. Only when Enzo Marchetti entered and sat down at the head of the table did they begin taking their seats one by one, and the scrape of chairs across the tile floor was the only sound in the room. Sal Fiore sat on the right side, 3 places away from him, in the same seat he had occupied for so many years. Enzo placed a stack of papers on the table and pushed it across the wood toward him. He didn't say a word. Sal picked up the top sheet, looked at it, then set it back down. He didn't turn to the second page. He said medicine was still medicine, the same active ingredient, the same purpose, only the label and the price were different. And he said none of those old people in there could tell the difference anyway. He said it with the manner of a man explaining something obvious to someone younger than himself. No one in the room moved. Enzo said that as of today, Sal no longer had his name attached to anything in this family. No men, no share, no seat at this table. Then he said that tomorrow morning Sal would go to the state prosecutor's office himself, carrying every document connected to that company, and tell them everything himself. Sal stood up. He said Enzo's father's name and said he had carried this boy in his arms before he could walk, that if his father were still alive, he would never have allowed this to happen. Enzo said his father had also died in a bed with no one holding his hand, and if Sal wanted to bring him into this, he had chosen the wrong man. Sal said he had done it for this family too, for profits everyone had benefited from. Enzo said there were many things in this family he could close his eyes to, but taking money from people who couldn't even open the lid of their own medicine bottle wasn't one of them, and that wasn't his father's law. It was his. Sal said that if he talked, he would tell them everything, not only his own part. Enzo sat there looking at him for a long time, then said that if Sal wanted to drag others down with him, that was his choice. But as far as Enzo was concerned, he wouldn't say one word to stop it. No one in the room spoke. Not one of the more than a dozen men sitting there opened his mouth to plead for Sal Fiore. Not even the ones who had attended his children's weddings. Sal Fiore stood there for one more beat, then picked up his coat and walked out, and when the door closed behind him, the entire table remained silent. Nico Barsanti sat at the far end of the room, and later he told someone that the frightening thing that day wasn't that Sal had been thrown out. It was that every man in that room had realized the man sitting at the head of the table was willing to burn his own people. That evening, Enzo went to Teresa House for the first time since the storm night, and he entered through the main gate, in the middle of the night, when the entire building had already gone dark. Corinne Ashford came down to the lobby in a coat she had thrown on in a hurry, and immediately understood who the man standing there was, not because she recognized his face, but because she saw the 2 cars parked outside the gate and the old lawyer waiting beside the door. She invited him upstairs to her office. He didn't go. She said she didn't know what he intended to do with the papers in his hands, but there was one thing she did know. She said she had worked with funding foundations long enough to understand that there were donors who never wanted their names to appear in any record, and that the day he brought this matter into the light would be the day a great many people walked into this building asking questions he wouldn't want anyone asking. She said she believed he was a man who knew how to calculate. Enzo listened to all of it, then answered in the calmest voice he had used since the night of the storm. He said she had calculated one thing correctly. Then he said she had calculated the rest wrong, because she thought he valued himself more than the name engraved on that sign. One night remained. The annual fundraising gala went ahead exactly as scheduled, because Corinne Ashford had sold the tickets weeks earlier, and because she believed the best way to put out a fire was to stand in the middle of the room and smile as brightly as possible. The common room had been rearranged into an auditorium, chairs set in rows, the old piano pushed against the wall, and the residents brought out to sit in the front row wearing their best sweaters. She stepped up to the podium, thanked the guests, then said that tonight the facility had the honor of welcoming its greatest benefactor, the man who for all these years had chosen to remain in the shadows. She turned toward the door and invited him forward. Enzo Marchetti walked from the back of the room toward the podium, and Corinne recognized him when he was still about 3 steps away from her. She couldn't hide it from her face in time. Her entire plan for all those months had rested on one assumption, that the man funding this building was someone who would never dare allow anyone to look too closely at him, and she had lived comfortably with that belief. Now she was staring at the thin scar crossing the left eyebrow of the same man she herself had ordered put in handcuffs in this very lobby. Enzo took the microphone and introduced himself by name. He said the brass sign above the reception desk bore his grandmother's name. He said this building had been created because she had died in a room with no one beside her, and because he never wanted there to be another night like that. Then he said that on the first night he returned here, he had been thrown out through that very door. And he said he wasn't telling them this to blame anyone. He was telling them because it had shown him what this place had become. In the front row, Josephine Alderman stood up. That afternoon she had been given a typed page to read aloud, thanking the facility, and she had been holding it in her hands the entire evening. She set it down on the chair. She said that the week before, she had been told that if she wasn't cheerful enough, she would be transferred somewhere else, farther away, where her granddaughter wouldn't be able to visit every Sunday. She said she had been afraid all week. Then she said she was old now, and she wasn't afraid anymore. A murmur spread through the room. Wade Kessler rose from the staff section in the back, walked to the front, and placed 2 things on the table beside the podium, an old wedding ring and a sealed envelope, still stamped, never opened. He said he had taken the ring from Walter's hand on the storm night, and he had taken it because other belongings from the residence, after being collected for safekeeping, had never found their way back to where they belonged, and he had told himself he was only keeping it safe for Walter. Then, when someone else was suspected, he had stayed silent. He picked up the envelope and said that months earlier, Walter had asked him to mail a letter outside the facility, and Wade had been the one collecting the outgoing mail, and he hadn't dropped it into the mailbox. He said all he had to do was let it fall into the box, that was all, and he hadn't done it. Then he said one final thing, that people don't become bad in a single day. They become bad little by little, and every time there is always a reason that sounds perfectly reasonable. Walter, sitting in the front row, raised his hand. He didn't speak. He only pointed toward the piano against the wall. Enzo followed his gesture. And in that moment, the 3 broken syllables Walter had struggled with, all his strength to force out in the lobby on the storm night, suddenly came together in Enzo's mind, with their true meaning. Piano. Inside. Case. Nico walked over and lifted the lid of the piano case. Beneath the felt lining was a notebook thicker than the one Delia had carried, and inside it, across hundreds of pages, Walter had handwritten the identification number printed on every blister pack of medication he had received each day, without missing a day, with the habit of a man who had spent 40 years recording the measurements of every piano wire. Augie Rinaldi picked up the notebook, opened the invoice records beside it, and needed less than a minute to find the 2 numbers that matched. He told the entire room that this was enough to submit, enough to stand before any board. Then Enzo looked down into the room, searched for someone near the back, and said that this place didn't need any more evidence. It only needed one question. Delia Mercer stood. She walked up the center aisle, stopped in front of Corinne Ashford, and said her mother's name, said the name of the facility across the river, said the date her mother died. Then she asked whether Corinne remembered her. Corinne opened her mouth. She looked at Delia, and there was nothing in her eyes. She didn't remember. The entire room saw it. The guests were all gone before midnight. The chairs had been stacked back against the wall, and the residents were taken to their rooms one by one. By the time the entire building had gone dark, only 3 people remained in the common room. Augie Rinaldi spread the papers across the lid of the piano because there wasn't a single table left that hadn't already been cleared away, and he arranged them in neat rows across the wood worn smooth by years of use. He didn't rush him. He explained it one more time, clearly. He believed that a man about to sign something deserved to hear all of it. He said that once this file was submitted to the state attorney general, it wouldn't stop with that woman. He said they would trace the money backward, and the money trail began with the foundation, and the foundation carried his grandmother's name. He said the foundation's accounts would be frozen the moment the audit began. That audits like this, in this state, lasted a very long time, much longer than the timelines written in official documents, and throughout all those months, not a single dollar from those accounts would be able to flow into this building. He said that meant Teresa House itself would be the first place to suffer the consequences. Staff wages, electricity, medication, food for the 40 people sleeping in the rooms beyond that wall, all of it would have to come from somewhere else, and that somewhere else would have to be cleaned down to the last dollar, every dollar accounted for, and that was something he couldn't promise would be enough. He said that if Enzo wanted, there was another way. That woman could be removed quietly. Her license could be taken away without a single formal complaint being filed, and everything could be closed within a week without anyone outside ever knowing. He said it was his duty to present both choices. Enzo stood looking down at the polished wood. He asked whether, if they chose the other way, the families who had been overcharged would get anything back. Augie said no. He asked whether the people sleeping in other facilities would gain anything from it. Augie said no again. Enzo picked up the pen. He signed where the old man pointed, one page after another, without pausing on a single one, and when he finished the last page, he placed the pen on the piano lid and stood still. Augie gathered the papers into his briefcase, snapped the lock shut, and said he would go first thing in the morning, as soon as the other office opened. Then he picked up his hat and left. Enzo didn't follow him. He pulled out the small bench in front of the piano and sat down, both hands resting on his knees, his back straight, in exactly the posture he had held through the entire night in the holding room. The only light in the room came from the emergency lamp in the hallway. Outside the door, Nico Barsanti stood watching. He had been there since the old lawyer first spread the papers out, and he had heard everything. He knew the amount of money his boss would lose over the months ahead, and he knew the man had just signed his name to losing it. Nico started to step inside. Then he didn't. He took one step back and remained in the hallway with his back to the door, waiting. Inside, the man sitting at the piano didn't open the lid and didn't touch a single key. He simply sat there for a very long time. The next morning, the police cars arrived before 8 o'clock, and Inspector Frank Coyle was the first man through the lobby doors. He didn't look around and didn't ask anyone a question. He went straight upstairs to the second floor, and a short while later he came back down with Corinne Ashford. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She only asked to get her coat. As she passed the reception desk, she lifted her eyes toward the brass sign mounted on the wall, then lowered them again. Coyle paused for a moment at the door. He looked toward Enzo Marchetti standing at the far end of the lobby. He didn't say anything, didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't mention the night he had authorized a detention without even a single report on file. He only looked at him once, then turned away, and the door closed behind them. That afternoon, when the lobby had grown quiet and the sunlight was slanting through the western windows, Walter Pruitt was wheeled into the common room as usual and settled into the chair beside the old piano. He placed one hand on the lid, then he began to hum, very softly, without words, that same melody. Enzo Marchetti was standing at the far end of the room speaking with Augie when he stopped in the middle of a sentence. He turned his head. He listened for one more measure, then walked over and stood there looking at Walter as though the floor had just dropped away beneath his feet. In the final letter his grandmother had written to him from the room across the city, there was a passage Enzo had read so many times that he knew it by heart. She had written that she was often afraid at night, and that there was a man who worked the night shift there, not a doctor, not a nurse, who would stop by her room whenever he passed and sit with her for a little while, and that he used to sing a very old song, quietly, and she said that when she heard it, she could fall asleep. On her final night, she hadn't gone alone. The man who stayed with her was him. In her will, she left her coastal property to the man who sat with me on my final night, and she had written only one surname because she had never asked his first name. Pruitt. Enzo had searched for that name for 11 years. He had hired people to trace the staff records from that facility and been told that the night shift personnel files from that period had been destroyed after a merger. He had placed notices, made inquiries, and waited. In the end, he built a home on that very piece of land, put his grandmother's name on the brass sign, and permanently left one room there free of charge, unavailable for anyone to reserve, simply in case the man ever appeared. 2 years earlier, a state social worker had placed an elderly man who had recently suffered a mild stroke, with no children and nowhere else to go, into that exact empty room. No one knew, not even the man who had been placed there. The person Enzo Marchetti had searched for almost his entire life had been sleeping beneath his roof for 2 years, and on that rain-soaked night, Enzo had carried him on his back through the storm without knowing who he was. Once everything became clear, Enzo offered to rebuild the West Wing into a private apartment for Walter, with his own kitchen, his own entrance, and his name on the door. Walter shook his head. He took out paper and a pen and wrote that he didn't need another door to close, and that if Enzo wanted to do something, he should find a few people willing to stay through the night. From those words came the program called No One Leaves Alone, and from then on, every night at Teresa House, someone sat beside the weakest resident until morning. The following afternoon, Enzo handed Delia an envelope. She opened it expecting to find a check. Inside was the decision restoring her professional license, along with the fully recovered original recording, including the footage before and after, including the moment the name card at the head of the bed was changed, and then changed back. He said that money was something he had once had plenty of, but what they had taken from her wasn't money. They had taken away her right to be believed, and that was what he was giving back. Delia held the envelope in both hands, and couldn't say a word. A few months later, on a very quiet night, Walter passed away in his sleep. Delia had been sitting beside his bed since early evening, his hand resting in hers, and she stayed there until morning. This time, she wasn't late. On the day the new wing opened, the neighborhood children came to sing for the residents in the common room, missing the rhythm in a few places and making everyone burst out laughing. And afterward they went around giving flowers to each person one by one. Out on the porch, Delia stood beside Enzo looking inside. She said she still owed him a phone call. He said she had already repaid it, because that night she had been the only person who had tried to lend him one. This story leaves us with something very simple, that a person's worth isn't measured by the clothes they wear or the money in their pocket. A decent society is measured by how it treats those who can no longer protect themselves, and by whether anyone is willing to listen to the people everyone else has decided are no longer worth hearing. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to speak, one person willing to stay, to change the fate of many others. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories each day. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear what comes from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.